On the morning of April 30th, 1943, a Spanish fisherman named José Antonio Rey María was working his nets off the coast of Huelva in southern Spain when he spotted something floating in the water. At first he thought it was just debris from the war that raged across Europe, but as he drew closer his blood ran cold. It was a body, a man in a British military uniform, face down in the Mediterranean waves. The fisherman pulled the corpse aboard and immediately notified the Spanish authorities. Within hours, Spanish soldiers arrived to take possession of the body. They found something unusual. Chained to the dead man's wrist was a black leather briefcase, and in his pockets they found identification papers. He was Major William Martin of the Royal Marines, attached to Combined Operations Headquarters. The Spanish, though officially neutral in the war, had many officers sympathetic to Nazi Germany. Word quickly reached German intelligence. A British officer, dead in the water, carrying what appeared to be top-secret military documents. The Germans were very interested indeed. But Major William Martin had never existed. He was a fiction, a ghost, and his death was the most carefully orchestrated lie of the entire Second World War. This is the story of Operation Mincemeat, the audacious plan to fool Hitler himself using nothing more than a dead man, some fake letters, and extraordinary British cunning. To understand Operation Mincemeat, we need to go back to early 1943. The tide of the war was beginning to turn in favor of the Allies. In North Africa, British and American forces had driven back the Germans and Italians. Victory there was within reach. The question wasn't if the Allies would win in Africa, but what would come next. The answer was obvious to everyone, including the Germans. The next logical target was the island of Sicily. It sat like a stepping stone between North Africa and mainland Italy. Control Sicily, and you could control the Mediterranean. Control the Mediterranean, and you could strangle Axis supply lines. Sicily was the key to invading Italy and opening up a new front in Europe. But here was the problem. Because it was so obvious, the Germans knew it too. They were reinforcing Sicily, preparing for the inevitable invasion. If the Allies tried a frontal assault on a heavily defended island, the casualties would be catastrophic. Thousands of young men would die on those beaches. British intelligence needed to do something extraordinary. They needed to make the Germans believe the invasion was going somewhere else. Anywhere else. They needed to convince Hitler to move his troops away from Sicily to defend targets that the Allies had no intention of attacking. That's where two British intelligence officers entered the story, Lieutenant Commander Ewan Montagu and Flight Lieutenant Charles Cholmondeley. These two men would conceive and execute one of the most bizarre and brilliant deception operations in military history. Ewan Montagu was a brilliant lawyer before the war, from an aristocratic Jewish family. He'd been a rising star in the British legal system, a successful barrister who'd tried notable cases. When war broke out, his sharp mind and attention to detail made him perfect for intelligence work. He joined the Naval Intelligence Division. Charles Cholmondeley was quite different. An eccentric RAF officer with a creative streak, he'd already been thinking about unconventional ways to deceive the enemy. He was imaginative, willing to think outside every possible box. Together, they were a formidable team, and they had inspiration from an unusual source. In 1939, before the war even really got started, Admiral John Godfrey, the Director of Naval Intelligence, had produced a memorandum. It was called the Trout Memo, and it compared deceiving the enemy in wartime to fly fishing. The fisherman casts his line patiently, changes his lures, gives the water a rest when needed, but always tries to attract the fish with something enticing. The memo listed 54 different ways to fool the enemy, and one of those ideas would become Operation Mincemeat. The idea was this: take a dead body, dress it as a courier carrying important documents, and let it wash up somewhere the enemy would find it. The Germans would believe they'd stumbled upon genuine intelligence, and they'd act on it. That memo, by the way, had the fingerprints of Admiral Godfrey's personal assistant all over it. A young lieutenant commander named Ian Fleming. Yes, that Ian Fleming, the man who would later create James Bond. Even in 1939, Fleming was thinking like a spy novelist, dreaming up plots that seemed too fantastic to be real. Montagu and Cholmondeley took this wild idea to the 20 Committee. This was Britain's counterintelligence operation, so named because the Roman numerals for 20, XX, form a double cross. The committee reviewed and approved deception operations. At first, they rejected the corpse idea. It seemed too far-fetched, too dependent on things going right that were beyond anyone's control. But the chairman of the committee, John Masterman, saw potential. He was intrigued. He told Montagu and Cholmondeley to develop the plan further, work out the details, make it feasible. And so they did. The operation had to be meticulous. Every detail had to be perfect. One small mistake, one inconsistency, and the Germans would smell a rat. They'd know it was a plant, and the deception would fail. Worse, it might make them more suspicious of genuine intelligence that fell into their hands later. First, they needed a body. Not just anybody. It had to be a man of the right age, someone who could plausibly be a Royal Marine officer, and crucially, it had to be someone whose death wouldn't cause a scandal, whose family wouldn't ask too many questions. Montagu consulted Sir Bernard Spilsbury, the leading pathologist in Britain. Spilsbury was famous for his work on criminal cases, a legend in forensic medicine. He agreed to help, but he warned them. Finding the right corpse would be difficult. They needed someone recently deceased, whose body would appear to have drowned, and they couldn't make inquiries that would attract attention. For weeks, they searched. It seemed impossible. Then, in a warehouse in London, they found him, a homeless man from Wales, 34 years old, who died from eating rat poison containing phosphorus. His name was Glyndwr Michael. Now, you might think eating rat poison would be obvious upon examination, but Spilsbury assured them that in a body that had been in the water for days, the effects of the poison would be difficult to distinguish from drowning or hypothermia. The Spanish doctors conducting the autopsy wouldn't look too closely. They'd see a drowned British officer and leave it at that. Glyndwr Michael would become Major William Martin, and in death, this poor homeless man would perform one of the most important services of the entire war. Creating Major William Martin was like writing a novel. Every detail of his life had to be invented, but it all had to feel real. If the Germans investigated, if they checked the details, everything had to hold up under scrutiny. Montagu became obsessed with what he called pocket litter, the small, personal items people carry that tell the story of their lives. A real officer wouldn't just have official documents. He'd have receipts, tickets, letters, photographs. The accumulation of a life lived. So they created William Martin's life, piece by piece. He had a father who wrote him letters. They composed correspondence from father, expressing paternal concern and pride. William had a fiancée named Pam. They created love letters from her, sweet and intimate, the kind of letters a young woman writes to her man who's going off to war. Pam worried about William. She told him she loved him. She mentioned their engagement. They created a receipt for an engagement ring from a London jeweler. Bills from William's tailor, complaining about delayed payments, just like a real young officer might have. A stern letter from his bank about his overdraft. Ticket stubs from a London theatre, showing that William had gone to see a show the night before he left on his mission. They even had a photograph taken of a young woman to serve as Pam. One of the intelligence staff, Jean Leslie, agreed to pose for the picture. She became the face of William Martin's fiancée, unknowingly playing a role in the deception. But the most important items weren't in William's pockets. They were in that briefcase chained to his wrist. The key to the entire operation was in two documents. They had to be letters between high-ranking officers, discussing matters important enough that they'd be sent by courier rather than by cable or radio. They had to contain information that would be devastating if it fell into enemy hands. And they had to point the Germans away from Sicily. The main letter was written by Lieutenant General Sir Archibald Nye, Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, one of the most senior officers in the British Army. It was addressed to General Sir Harold Alexander, who commanded Allied forces in North Africa. The letter was a masterpiece of misdirection. It opened casually, as correspondence between friends often does. "My dear Alex," it began. Then it discussed various military administrative matters, the appointment of officers, medals, routine things that gave it authenticity and weight. Then came the critical information. The letter mentioned Operation Husky, describing it as an invasion of Greece. It named target beaches, discussed troop numbers and divisions. It made Greece sound like the certain target of the next Allied offensive. But here's where it got clever. Really clever. The letter also mentioned a smaller operation, Operation Brimstone, against Sicily, and Nye wrote, almost as an aside, "We stand a very good chance of making the Germans think we will go for Sicily. It is an obvious objective, and one about which they must be nervous. Do you see the brilliance? It was a double bluff." The letter was saying in effect, "We know the Germans will expect us to invade Sicily because it's obvious, so we're going to let them think that's the plan. But really, we're going to Greece." When the Germans read this, they'd think they'd seen through the Allied deception. They'd believe Sicily was a feint, a diversion, and that Greece was the real target. They'd congratulate themselves on their intelligence work and move troops accordingly. With the body prepared and the documents ready, they needed to get Major William Martin to Spain. They couldn't just dump him in the water near a beach. The whole thing had to look like an air crash. An officer flying on a mission, his plane going down over the sea, his body washing ashore. They called in Charles Fraser Smith, a man with an extraordinary job. Fraser Smith was essentially the real-life version of Q from the James Bond novels. He designed special equipment for British intelligence, gadgets and containers and disguises. Ian Fleming knew about him, and years later, Fraser Smith would inspire the character Q. Fraser Smith designed a special container to preserve the body. It looked like a large canister for a life raft. Inside, packed with dry ice, was Glyndwr Michael, dressed as Major William Martin, complete with his uniform, his pocket litter, and that crucial briefcase chained to his wrist. The container was transported by one of England's leading race car drivers to a Royal Navy submarine, HMS Seraph. The submarine had its own interesting history, having already been involved in secret operations, but this would be its strangest mission yet. On April 19, 1943, HMS Seraph left Scotland under sealed orders. The crew didn't know what was in that large canister stored in their submarine. Only the captain, Lieutenant Norman Jewell, knew the truth. They were carrying a corpse on a mission to deceive Hitler. The submarine traveled south, making its way carefully through waters patrolled by German U-boats and aircraft. On the night of April 30th, they arrived at their destination, about a mile off the coast of Huelva in southern Spain. Why Huelva? It was chosen very carefully. Spain was officially neutral, but the local military and intelligence officers in that region were known to be sympathetic to Germany. There was a German spy network operating in the area. If a body washed up there with secret documents, the information would reach German intelligence quickly. But there was more to it. The tides and currents around Huelva were just right. They'd carry a body to shore without too much decomposition, but after enough time in the water to be believable. Just after 4:30 in the morning, Lieutenant Jewell and his crew brought the canister on deck. They opened it. The body, after days in dry ice, was stiff and cold. They inflated a life jacket on Major Martin to ensure he'd float face down, the way a drowning victim would. They secured the briefcase to his wrist with a chain. Then, they read a prayer. These British sailors, about to commit an act of deception, still felt the need to give this poor man, whoever he'd been in life, a moment of respect. They read Psalm chapter 39. I said, I will take heed to my ways, that I sin not with my tongue. They slid the body into the water. It floated for a moment, then began to drift toward shore. The submarine destroyed the canister with explosives and quickly submerged. Lieutenant Jewell sent a brief coded message to London. Mincemeat completed. Now all they could do was wait. The Spanish fisherman who found the body did exactly what was expected. He reported it to the authorities. Spanish soldiers came and collected Major William Martin. The body was taken to Huelva and handed over to a naval judge. The British vice-consul in Huelva, a man named Francis Haselden, was officially informed. He'd been briefed on the operation, though he didn't know all the details. He began sending urgent cables to London, demanding the return of the briefcase. These cables were intentionally sent using codes that the British knew had been broken by the Germans. The messages played out a script. Major Martin was carrying highly important documents. It is imperative we recover them immediately. This matter has the highest priority. The Spanish authorities, seeing the British panic, became even more interested. The briefcase was opened. Inside were the letters from General Nye and other official documents. Photographs were taken. Copies were made. And quietly, through back channels, the information was passed to German intelligence in Madrid. The Germans were ecstatic. They'd intercepted real British military plans. Or so they thought. The documents went up the chain of command rapidly, from Madrid to Berlin, from intelligence officers to military planners, from the Wehrmacht to the Führer himself. Adolf Hitler read about the planned invasion of Greece. He read about the feint toward Sicily. And he believed it. Orders went out immediately. German divisions were transferred from Sicily to Greece and the Balkans. Troops were sent to Sardinia. The Germans doubled their forces in Greece, preparing for an invasion that would never come. Meanwhile, back in Spain, the British kept up their act. Haselden continued his urgent requests for the briefcase. When it was finally returned, British intelligence carefully examined it. They could tell it had been opened, photographed, and resealed. Perfect. There's a final detail to this story, both touching and sad. Major William Martin needed a proper burial. He couldn't just disappear. If the Germans checked later, they'd need to find a grave. So Glyndwr Michael, the homeless Welsh labourer who died from eating rat poison, was buried with full military honours in the Nuestra Señora de la Soledad cemetery in Huelva. Spanish officials attended. The British vice-consul was there, Prayers were said. A headstone was erected. It read, William Martin, born the 29th of March 1907, died the 24th of April 1943, beloved son of John Glyndwr Martin and the late Antonia Martin of Cardiff, Wales. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. That last line is Latin, from the Roman poet Horace. It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. The irony is profound. Glyndwr Michael had been a homeless man, forgotten by society, who died alone after eating rat poison. But in death, he was given an identity, a family, a purpose and honor. He was buried as a hero. And he had indeed died for his country, just not in any way he could have imagined. That grave still exists today. It's become a site of pilgrimage for historians and military enthusiasts. The headstone now acknowledges both names, William Martin and Glyndwr Michael, the man who never was, and the man who was forgotten, together in one grave. On July 9, 1943, Operation Husky began. The real Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. Allied forces, British, American and Canadian troops, landed on the beaches of Sicily in the largest amphibious operation yet attempted in the war. They expected fierce resistance. Sicily was, after all, the obvious target. The Allies had 160,000 men ready for the assault. But something remarkable happened. The German resistance was much lighter than expected. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, had only token forces on Sicily. Even hours after the invasion began, German aircraft were still being diverted to Sardinia, still expecting an attack there that never came. German ground forces on Sicily were undermanned and undersupplied. The divisions that should have been there defending the island were in Greece, in Sardinia, spread across the Balkans, waiting for phantom invasions. The Allies, who'd planned for a 90-day campaign with heavy casualties, took the entire island in just 38 days. British and American casualties were far lower than the worst-case scenarios had predicted. Thousands of young men who might have died on those beaches survived because German troops weren't there to meet them. The success wasn't just military. The invasion of Sicily led directly to the fall of Mussolini. The Italian fascist dictator was overthrown just days after the invasion began. Italy would soon surrender to the Allies, taking one of the three main Axis powers out of the war entirely. And it all traced back to that body floating in the water off Huelva, to those fake letters written by Ewan Montagu and his team, to the brilliance of Operation Mincemeat. But how did the British know it had worked? How could they be sure the Germans had taken the bait? This is where another piece of British intelligence brilliance comes in, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park. You've probably heard of Alan Turing and the cracking of the German Enigma codes. Well, those codebreakers weren't just breaking codes, they were reading German military communications in real time. After the body was found, British intelligence listened in as German signals discussed the documents. They read messages sent from Madrid to Berlin. They watched as Hitler's high command issued orders based on the false information. They could literally track the deception working its way through the German military machine. On May 11th, just 11 days after the body was found, a message was sent to Winston Churchill, who was visiting the United States at the time. It was from Brigadier Leslie Hollis, Secretary to the Chiefs of Staff Committee. It read, "Mincemeat swallowed rod, line and sinker by the right people, and from the best information they look like acting on it." Churchill must have been elated. One of the most audacious intelligence operations ever attempted had worked. But the operation remained top secret. Even after Sicily was taken, even after the war ended, Operation Mincemeat stayed classified. Montagu and Cholmondeley couldn't tell anyone what they'd done. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park couldn't reveal they'd been reading German communications. The men who'd served on HMS Seraph couldn't explain why they'd carried a corpse in a canister. The secret held for nearly a decade. Then, in 1950, something happened that forced the British government's hand. A former cabinet minister named Duff Cooper, who'd been briefed on Operation Mincemeat back in 1943, published a novel. It was called Operation Heartbreak, and it featured a plot about a corpse washed ashore in Spain carrying false documents to deceive the Germans. The character was named William Marrington instead of William Martin, but the similarities were unmistakable. The British security services faced a dilemma. The story was getting out anyway, through fiction. People would start asking questions, so they made a decision. They'd publish the real story themselves, but carefully control what was revealed. They asked Ewan Montagu to write a book, and over the course of a single weekend, working at breakneck speed, Montagu wrote The Man Who Never Was. It was published in 1953 and became an instant sensation. The book sold 2 million copies. People couldn't believe such a thing had really happened. a dead man, fake letters, and Hitler himself fooled. It seemed like fiction, but it was true. In 1956, it was adapted into a film of the same name. The movie was a success, bringing Operation Mincemeat to an even wider audience. Interestingly, Montagu himself appeared in the film, playing himself in a brief scene. But there were still secrets Montagu couldn't reveal. The security services wouldn't let him mention that Bletchley Park had confirmed the operation's success by reading German communications. That information wouldn't be declassified for decades. And Montagu couldn't name Charles Cholmondeley as his partner in the operation. Cholmondeley had to remain anonymous until much later. For Charles Cholmondeley, the eccentric RAF officer who'd helped conceive the plan, the silence must have been difficult. Montagu got the credit, the recognition, the book, the film. Cholmondeley got a Member of the Order of the British Empire in 1948, but he couldn't tell anyone why. He had to watch his partner receive accolades, while remaining in the shadows. It wasn't until years later that Cholmondeley's role was fully acknowledged. He'd been the one who'd first proposed using a corpse for deception. He'd worked alongside Montagu on every detail. But such is the nature of intelligence work. Not everyone can be celebrated, and sometimes the most important contributions remain classified for decades. As for Glyndwr Michael, the real man behind Major William Martin, his story remained unknown even longer. Montagu's book and the film didn't reveal the true identity of the corpse. They couldn't, for legal and ethical reasons. The man's family, if he had any, didn't know what had happened to him. As for Glyndwr Michael, the real man behind Major William Martin, his story remained unknown even longer. Montagu's book and the film didn't reveal the true identity of the corpse. They couldn't, for legal and ethical reasons. The man's family, if he had any, didn't know what had happened to him. It wasn't until 1996 that researchers finally identified Glyndwr Michael as the body used in Operation Mincemeat. When they did, there was a movement to honor him properly. In 1998, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission added a plaque to his grave, acknowledging both identities. Glyndwr Michael served as Major William Martin, RM. The story of Operation Mincemeat has continued to fascinate people into the 21st century. In 2010, the historian Ben Macintyre published a comprehensive book on the operation, using newly declassified documents to tell the full story in greater detail than ever before. Macintyre's book revealed information that even Montagu's account couldn't include. Then, in 2022, a new film was made, Operation Mincemeat, directed by John Madden and starring Colin Firth as Ewan Montagu and Matthew Macfadyen as Charles Cholmondeley, brought the story to a new generation. This time, both men were properly credited. This time, the full complexity of the operation could be shown. The film was a critical success. Audiences were reminded that World War II wasn't just won on battlefields. It was won in offices and laboratories, by codebreakers and intelligence officers, by people who fought with their minds rather than guns. Museums now have exhibits dedicated to Operation Mincemeat. You can see some of the actual documents that were planted on the body. You can read the love letters from the fictitious PAM. You can see photographs of the real people involved. The grave in Spain has become a pilgrimage site. British veterans, military historians, tourists, all come to pay respects to the man who never was, and to the man who really was. Operation Mincemeat wasn't the only deception operation of World War II, but it was perhaps the most audacious and successful. The Allies used deception throughout the war, dummy tanks and fake radio traffic, like the Ghost Army in Europe, double agents feeding false information to the Germans, elaborate ruses and misdirections. These operations saved lives. Every German soldier stationed in Greece instead of Sicily, because of Operation Mincemeat, was one less soldier shooting at Allied troops on the beaches. Every aircraft sent to Sardinia was one less bombing run over the actual invasion fleet. The lessons learned from Mincemeat were applied to later operations. Operation Fortitude, the massive deception campaign to conceal the true location of the D-Day landings in 1944, used many of the same principles. Make the enemy see what you want them to see. Give them intelligence that seems too good to be true, but is so detailed and convincing they can't help but believe it. There's even evidence that Operation Mincemeat worked almost too well. Later in the war, when the Germans captured genuine Allied documents, they sometimes dismissed them as plants, as fake intelligence designed to deceive them, just like the William Martin papers had been. The success of one deception made the Germans paranoid about all intelligence. Ewan Montagu returned to his legal career after the war. He became a judge advocate of the fleet, effectively a naval judge. He continued to work on intelligence matters, though never on anything quite as dramatic as Operation Mincemeat. He was appointed an officer of the Order of the British Empire in 1944 for his wartime service. He lived until 1985, long enough to see his operation become famous, and to know that he'd contributed to saving countless lives. Charles Cholmondeley left the RAF and lived quietly. He rarely spoke about his wartime service, even after the story became public. He'd done extraordinary work that changed the course of the war, but he was content to remain in the background. He passed away in 1982. Lieutenant Norman Jewell, the submarine commander who'd carried out the mission, continued his naval career. He never forgot that strange night off the coast of Spain, sliding a corpse into the water. Of all the missions he'd undertaken, that was the one he'd remember most. The crew of HMS Seraph went on to other operations, other secret missions. The submarine itself survived the war and was eventually scrapped in 1965, but its place in history was secure. Today, Operation Mincemeat is studied in military academies and intelligence schools around the world. It's taught as a masterclass in deception, in attention to detail, in understanding your enemy's mindset. The operation worked because Montagu and Cholmondeley understood how intelligence works. They knew the Germans wouldn't just believe documents that fell into their hands. They'd verify, investigate, check the details. So every detail had to be perfect. The body had to be right. The uniform had to be correct. The pocket litter had to tell a consistent story. The documents had to be at the right level of importance, with the right kind of information. And they understood psychology. The double bluff worked because it played on what the Germans expected. Of course, the Allies would try to deceive them. Of course, Sicily was the obvious target. So when they read a document that said, "We're making them think we'll attack Sicily, but really we're going to Greece," why, it seemed brilliant. The Germans thought they'd seen through the deception, when in reality, they'd fallen for it completely. This is why Operation Mincemeat remains relevant today. Deception isn't about lying. It's about telling a lie that fits perfectly with what your enemy already believes, with what they want to believe. It's about making them think they're being clever when they're actually being fooled. The story of Operation Mincemeat is extraordinary in every sense. It's about creativity in warfare, about using imagination as a weapon. It's about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Ewan Montagu and Charles Cholmondeley weren't commandos or fighter pilots. They were staff officers, working in offices, writing letters, and creating false identities. But their work was every bit as crucial as any battle. It's about sacrifice too. Glyndwr Michael didn't volunteer for his role. He couldn't have, but in death his body served a purpose that saved lives. There's something both unsettling and profound about that. We've used this man, who society had forgotten, who died in poverty and despair, and turned him into a hero. Is that redemption? Exploitation? Perhaps both. The families who lost loved ones in Sicily, or who would have lost them if the island had been more heavily defended, owe a debt to a homeless man they never knew existed, and to intelligence officers whose names they wouldn't learn for decades. It's about secrecy and the burden of secrets. The men who planned and executed Operation Mincemeat had to remain silent for years. They watched the invasion succeed, knowing their contribution, unable to speak of it. They saw colleagues receive recognition for other actions, while their own greatest achievement remained classified. And it's about the strange, almost absurd reality of modern warfare. Wars are fought not just with tanks and planes, but with lies and misdirection. The course of history can be changed by a corpse in the water, by fake love letters, by a carefully worded document placed in the right hands. Major William Martin never was, but his impact on history was real. He existed in the minds of German intelligence officers, in the calculations of Wehrmacht generals, in the orders sent to troops across the Mediterranean. He was a fiction, but he changed reality. Glyndwr Michael was real. He lived, suffered, and died. And then, after death, he became someone else, someone important, someone who mattered. His final act, unknowing and involuntary, was one of the most significant contributions any individual made to the Allied victory. Today, when you visit that grave in Huelva, you'll see both names, the real man and the fictional officer. Truth and deception. Together they tell one of the most remarkable stories of World War II. The operation that began as a paragraph in Ian Fleming's memo that seemed too bizarre to work, that depended on perfect execution and extraordinary luck, succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. It saved lives. It shortened campaigns. It proved that in war, intelligence and imagination can be as powerful as any weapon. This is the story of Operation Mincemeat. The man who never was, and the operation that was so successful, they had to keep it secret for a decade. A dead body, some fake letters, and the audacity to believe such an outrageous plan could actually work. And it did work. Brilliantly. As Winston Churchill himself said when he heard the news, anyone but a bloody fool would know it was Sicily. But thanks to Ewan Montagu, Charles Cholmondeley, and the man they called Major William Martin, the Germans were looking everywhere but Sicily. And that made all the difference.